Welcome. Thank you for joining our Quality Assurance and Auditing Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Bob Lucchese, USDM Vice President and Subject Matter Expert for Life Sciences, will be presenting. The discussion today will cover introductions, webinar logistics, direction for post-webinar collaboration, and our discussion topic, risk-based supplier management. We are proud to have Bob as our Vice President leading the USDM Quality and Compliance team. He offers more than 25 years in quality assurance and regulatory compliance in pharma, biotech, medical device, engineering, and nuclear industries. His expertise extends to several USDM practice areas, including quality and auditing, enterprise quality management, ECM, as well as our governance, risk, and compliance practices. Among his many accomplishments, Bob has presented on many compliance and regulatory subjects worldwide, including, most recently, the new ASTM E2500 model for validation. He has led audit teams for policies and procedures, Part 11, NIST, supplier, vendor, both internal and external, mock recalls, and major life sciences assessments. Bob is an expert in risk-based validation methodologies, GAMP, enterprise, content management, data and content migrations, and overall pharmaceutical and medical device regulatory issues. Bob has worked with small, medium, and large life science firms worldwide and is recognized as a leader in his field. U.S. data management is focused exclusively on the life science domain. We're the market leader in providing IT, quality, and regulatory IT compliance professional service solutions. Our various dedicated practices include PLM, ERP, CRM, GRC, ECM, clinical and drug safety. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 150 life science clients. We offer hands-on experience assisting clients under regulatory distress, and we're the market leader in providing validation accelerator packs. The content of today's presentation will be covered in approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board on the lower left of your screen. Or you can join our discussion on LinkedIn following the session and post your questions there. If your questions are of a confidential nature, we're happy to address them offline. We do appreciate your taking the time to join us today, and now I'll turn the presentation over to Bob.
Thank you, Becky. I appreciate everyone's time today, wherever you are in the world. Hope everyone's having a great day, because I'm very excited to present this topic today. There are two areas that are very near and dear to my heart, and that includes risk. I've been around risk-based methodologies and frameworks for quite some time now, and I've also been around supplier vendors with assessments and audits, and I'm real happy to bring both of these together. Here at US Data Management, we were able to do some collaboration for many of our clients, adding risk to our vendor-supplier management programs. So I wanted to go over the agenda real quickly with you for today's presentation. The first thing I'm going to do is go over some common questions, problems that we've seen over the years from our clients that pertain to not only auditing of the supplier vendors, but the management of your suppliers and vendors. So we'll take a look at some of those questions and look how we could potentially solve some of those questions and problems. We're also going to look at the types of vendors and suppliers. So I'm guessing that most folks on the phone today deal in some way, either in quality or with some of the vendors and suppliers that you have to deal with on an approved supplier list. And there certainly are many different types of vendors and suppliers that we deal with in the life sciences area. So I'm going to go over just a few of them just to make sure that we're all on the same page here as far as who we're talking about and what type of management we're going to apply this risk to. Then we're going to take a look at the overview of our risk process at a very high level, followed by the details of that process. Now, there are many steps that you could apply to a risk-based vendor-supplier management system. I'll go over some basic details with you, and so my objective is really to get you to have a nice idea that there is something out there to apply risk to this type of environment. And if we have time, we're going to go over a quick case study of a recent client that we've dealt with at US Data Management that we applied this for. We wrote the SOPs and developed the framework for them. So we'll go over a case study at the very end, followed by a summary. Okay? All right, let's go to some questions and problems that we've seen. First of all, one of the areas we look at is what level of vendor-supplier audit do you conduct, or the management of those vendors? Do you have different levels of vendors? Do you apply different standards to some of your suppliers or distributors? Followed by, do I have to go on site for every vendor qualification? We get that quite a bit because, you know, it certainly takes time and effort and expenses to go on site to qualify or audit a particular supplier or vendor. So that's a question we get asked quite often, and we'll tackle that question by implementing some type of risk approach to figuring out if you should go on site or not, and I'll take a look at that a little bit later in this presentation. Are there differences, compliance differences between my vendors? How do I manage these vendors? Do I manage an API vendor differently than I would a calibration vendor? And certainly one of the problems is bandwidth to cover all of the different suppliers and vendors out there that you may deal with. Some of the larger companies that may be on the phone today certainly have many vendors and suppliers worldwide. And there's only certain bandwidth and personnel allocation that you could apply to manage these vendors. So applying a risk certainly helps in that area. One of the things we get sometimes is we just change vendors, and regulatory wants me to audit this new vendor now. So how do I go about doing that? Do I have a process for it? Do I have to drop everything and go on site to Singapore or New Zealand to audit this particular vendor? And finally, how do I determine risk associated with these audits or with the management of the vendors and suppliers? So let's take a look at some typical types of vendors out there. Again, there are several different types, and the folks on the phone may deal with some of these. You may deal with some different ones, but I just wanted to give some of the common ones here today. And they include vendors of active ingredients for pharmaceutical companies, so API type of vendors, raw material suppliers, folks that supply excipients. So that includes, you know, things like binders and fillers and flavors and different types of lubricants out there. We also deal with controlled material vendors, labeling services. Many vendors supply packaging services now. CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations, are some of the types of vendors. And then finally, contract laboratories. That includes folks that do some testing and calibration for you. So just some of the typical types of vendors and suppliers that we see out there that we could apply this risk-based approach towards. And let me just go to the next slide here. Now, this is the overview of the risk process that we apply here at USDM that you could apply at your own particular organization. Now, this applies to all vendors and suppliers. That includes the new ones and your existing ones, so those that are already on your approved supplier list, and any new vendors that may pop up in the near future, you could apply this risk process for. Some of the steps that I'll take a look at here, you can see the high-level steps here, but then we have some different factors that are associated with each step. Some of these areas could be minimized based on certain criteria that we'll find in our risk area that we'll take a look at today. So if we look at the first one, the identification of the vendor, that's where we usually start, and we suggest some type of vendor-supplier request form that's completed initially by the person starting this vendor identification process. So that could be someone from purchasing or someone from manufacturing. who will complete the request form. And one of the items that we put in that request form is determining the criticality of that vendor. So there's different levels of criticality for each vendor that I'll go over in the next 3 slides that I'll show everyone. And finally, you submit that form for approval. The initiator will to QA, who takes a look at it, make sure everything looks okay, and make sure that your criticality levels are within the structure of your organization. The next step is to send an initial form to the vendor, and this is a step where a lot of folks forget about. They don't send any preconceived information over to the vendors. So this includes things like you want a list of documents like their organization chart, their SOP index, any type of quality manual, current registration or certifications, and if they've had any agency findings. So that's important when we take a look at the different risk factors. The next step is to apply the risk numbering system. This is based on information that you're going to receive back from the vendor and any prior information that you've had on any previous audits that you've done for that supplier or vendor. It will determine the type of audit that you're going to do, and that includes whether it's on-site or do we just mail a questionnaire, or if the audit is even required. And most importantly, on the bottom here, it determines the frequency of the audit. So again, many companies go through their process, and around this time of year, they're going to be planning for various audits that they have to do for their suppliers over the coming year. And some of them may be every 6 months, some of them may be every year. Well, applying a risk-based approach to this will help determine that frequency, and I'll show you that towards the end of this presentation. And the last thing is to actually conduct the audit. And here's where you're going to either use your own templates or questionnaires, or certainly we've had our own that we've developed over the years. You're going to review the findings, and most importantly, you're going to reapply the risk factors that we'll talk about here in a second on a regular basis. So it's a work in progress where you want to go back and take a look at that vendor again. If you do a second audit, then your risk criteria may change, and I'll show you how that all works here in the next couple of slides. And the little note that I have down here in the bottom is certain institutions that are well known for setting standards, your NISTs, your ASTMs, they could be approved in the first step by filling out a request form. The vendor form doesn't need to be completed for them because they're pretty much standardized. Okay. All right, let's look at criticality determinations here. So when you're looking at your vendors and suppliers, you want to take a look at what they actually do for you. And you may have to go back to the contract, or you may know what this vendor already does. So the initiator of this form will probably know what they're going to be using this supplier for. The first level here is a critical level. If it's a critical categorized vendor, it's usually a vendor that provides any type of raw materials or services that come in direct product contact with, or whose failure represents a significant risk to the patient health and safety. You'll notice that some of this is similar to, if some of you are familiar with a risk-based validation approach, some of these apply to suppliers as well, and that includes that risk to the patient health and safety, or the actual product safety or quality of the product. So what you want to take a look at for critical levels is, will that vendor's product or will the ingredient affect the efficacy or the safety of one of your products that you're dealing with? Now, some of the vendors that we deal with include the suppliers of the APIs that I spoke about earlier, or excipients. Any of your contract manufacturers are typically fall under the level 1 or critical level of a vendor. Your analytical testing labs, your sterilization service providers, certainly folks that are doing clean-in-place and SIP type of validation for you, primary product label suppliers. These are all types of vendors that would fall under level 1 critical. Under the next level, the key level, these are folks that provide raw materials or services and whose failure of that product or material would cause a product performance malfunction, and it would fail to meet its intended use within its initial requirements, but most importantly, it doesn't represent a significant risk to the patient's safety. So if something could go wrong with the product that would maybe have a machine fail, but it really doesn't have any effect on the patient quality or the patient's safety, then that would fall under level 2. So some of these folks include your original equipment manufacturers, your contracted services for that provide services for, say, preventive maintenance, calibration and qualification of certain equipment, and that equipment obviously would fall under GXP. So it would be a GMP, GCP, a GLP type of environment. So they're the type of vendors that would fall under level 2 or key type of vendors. And finally, there's the minor vendors, or what we call the level 3. And these folks have no direct impact on product safety or performance. They don't come in contact with the product. So some of these vendors include your pest control vendors, your facility security monitoring, and vendors and suppliers who supply consulting services and computer services that don't include the validation of your GXP systems. So these are other types of services within maybe your IT organization that would fall under your supplier category for your IT area. Okay? Don't forget, if you have any questions, I know there's a lot to cover here in the short amount of time for this. If you have any questions, don't forget to enter that in the chat area, and I'll be glad to, time permitting, to answer them, or we could follow up later individually with folks. This slide here is basically for one of our clients. On the classification, we wanted to find out, we had certain criteria we wanted to put into a form to find out if we really need a request form or whether or not we need an on-site audit or just basically a questionnaire. And for this particular client, any three of the levels there came out to be that we needed a request form sent. However, if you look at the last column, is the on-site audit required? For level 1, generally speaking, if a vendor falls under level 1, even before you apply risk, you generally look at it where an on-site audit would be required. For level 2, generally, no, you can get away with a questionnaire. However, I do have a note, note at the bottom there that audits may be performed at the discretion of the quality department. So if you know that a vendor really should be on-site, or if it's a very first-time supplier or vendor that falls under level 2, you may want to consider the on-site audit. And it's certainly for level 3 categories, a simple questionnaire usually does the trick. Okay. Now I want to get into, spend a few moments here on risk ratings and how we apply risk to our supplier management. As you can see here on the slide, we have a scoring system that goes from 4 points down to 0 points. And then we have categories what we call our parameters. So I want to take a look at each one of these parameters to help you understand some of the areas you could start asking yourself in your organization, does this apply for your vendors or suppliers? First category is prior audits. It's very important that you go back and determine if an audit has already been done on a supplier. And if it has, you take a look at certain areas such as observations. So for this particular client that we're dealing with on this risk rating system, anything greater than 2 critical observations or greater than 6 major observations would be a critical area, and we would assign 4 points to that risk rating for that particular supplier. These are tried and true examples that we've found that usually fit into the mold of most companies. So the next area over would be 3 to 6 major observations. We would apply 3 points for. Anything less than 2 major observations, it's 1 point. And if a vendor has only some minor observations that when you conducted the qualification, initial qualification, or if they didn't have any, that certainly would be 0 points. Okay? The next area is the functional area for a supplier. So if there are significant issues around the functionality of this particular vendor that could impact the product or patient health or safety, then you would apply 4 points to that particular area. Again, if the issues impact the business but not the product, very similar to the criticality levels, then it would be 3 points. And then finally, if the functionality has some minor issues, you'd apply 1. If there's no issues at all, again, it's 0. So you can see where we're going here with the various parameters. Continuing on, we have something we call GMP supplier ratings that I know some companies utilize for their particular vendors. So after the initial qualification is performed, some vendors may come up to be unacceptable. Say they have no quality manual or they're not following any quality standards. Then you would deem them as unacceptable and subsequently assign 4 points to that risk rating. There is also minimally acceptable areas where they may have a quality manual but they haven't been following it. Areas like that for GMP supplier ratings that we use or classifications, that particular vendor would get 3 points. If it's an approved vendor already, for a GMP approved vendor, 1 point and so forth. Quality process and deviations, the next row down. If there's 1 or more critical deviations, then we like to assign 4 points to that particular supplier. If it's 1 or more major, it's 3 points. Any minor deviations, we drop down to 1 point, and certainly no deviation, 0. Finally, the change control. If there's 1 or more critical changes that we found that had to be applied to that supplier, it's 4 points. If it's 1 or more major changes, 3 points, and so forth. And finally, the last slide for the risk is if this supplier has had a warning letter in the past from the FDA, that's a 4-point high-risk category. If they've had 4 or more 483s or significant observations, we apply 3 points. If there's 3 or less 483s or significant observations, it's 1 point. If there's absolutely no external findings, it's 0. So very important here to take a look at the final risk scoring. If it's 18 points or more on this model, it's a high risk. 7 to 17 is a medium. Low risk is less. Low risk is 6 or less, and no risk at all is 0. So if everything became a 0, you have no risk for this particular supplier. The process map I'm going to take you through very quickly. These are just the steps leading up to what the risk priority numbering system means for your vendor management. So initially there's someone who starts the process. They identified a supplier, and the first thing they're going to do usually is look at your approved vendor or supplier log. If they're on there, then no action's necessary. Okay, they're already an approved supplier and they're not due for another audit. If they haven't been, if it's a new one, then you go on to the next steps. That includes what we talked about, the criticality assessment, forwarding over the supplier form to potential vendor or supplier, actually performing the audit for level 1, the on-site, as needed for level 2, and continuing to perform the risk assessment based on the information that came back, and then you update your approved vendor or supplier log. So this is the important step here, folks, that what you want to do is really take a look at your vendors and suppliers and begin to apply a risk-based approach to each one of them. And eventually, if you can see here on the bottom, you can get into some type of frequency of activity that you need for that vendor. Based on the risk, the frequency of the qualification and maintenance activities for that particular vendor could be adjusted based on their performance. Okay? So here I have an example that this particular client of ours was taking a look at various audit items and trying to put them into buckets by quarter. And what you could do is move everything in quarter 1, 2, and 3 all the way out to quarter 4 if that particular supplier became a low risk or was a low risk in your risk priority numbering system. Okay? So an example of this frequency of audits and the outcome of it is if the classification was level 1 and the method of review was an on-site audit, the risk classification was medium, then your frequency is once every 2 years. Okay, these are just examples that we have from one of our clients. On a level 2 classification, an on-site audit was performed. There was medium risk. Therefore, the frequency of the audits going forward is once every 3 years. Okay, so you don't, the key takeaway here is you don't arbitrarily have to assign dates on when you do these audits. You could have some type of scientific method used here to determine the frequency of the audit. For instance, level 3, if it's a low risk level 3 audit vendor, then you may do once every 4 years. Okay? So quickly on a case study here that we just did for a client. The client was a major pharmaceutical company who had some operations on the West Coast. The environment was they were a manufacturer of various types of drugs. They were a global manufacturer, so they had in-house manufacturing. They also used some CMOs. And they also had several laboratories for both research and production. So you can see under this environment, they certainly had quite a bit of problems because they have over 400 supplier vendors worldwide. They had severe bandwidth problem within their QA area. The company treated every vendor the same way, so they performed on-site audits for everyone. They contracted out all over the place to various client or consulting firms to assist with these on-site audits because they did on-site for every one of them. And they came to us and they said, you know what, there has to be a better way. They just didn't know how to get there. What we ended up doing was, our solution was we ended up implementing the risk-based vendor auditing management program for them. We ended up ranking companies based on various risk factors in categories that really distinguished between CMOs. They had no distinction between these types of vendors, your lab calibrators, also your wholesalers versus suppliers and how to deal with the differences. We began to leverage mailed questionnaires versus on-site audits. We changed the frequency of some of the audits based on some of the initial risk factors we came up with. So that increased the frequency for some of them because they became a very high risk, but it certainly decreased a lot more. And we were able to utilize their current staff for most of the audits. They still had to outsource some of them because there were so many, but in a much more effective manner. So that's some of the real cost savings and benefits to this. So, in summary, this is a practical, fairly straightforward best practice for conducting your vendor supplier audits or just managing your suppliers and vendors. Again, there's a lot of different ways to take this, but this is the most common that I went over today, applying these risk factors and classifications. So when you implement the risk scoring system, you get to leverage your current information. You get to systematically use questionnaires in a more proper fashion. You get to standardize the audit process and change the level of audits instead of just conducting your supplier vendor audits in the same way. And you absolutely have real-time savings with much more effective audits. So anyway, I'd like to thank you for your time today. I look forward to some more webinars over the next couple of months that I'll be doing around risk. And again, if you have any questions, I'm going to turn this over to Rebecca, and she'll summarize everything for us. So I appreciate your time, and have a great day, everyone. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Thanks, Bob. Great information there. Appreciate you sharing that. Okay, so we'll open the floor for questions. And several of you have asked, will the presentation be available? Yes, absolutely. Within 24 hours, it'll be posted to our website, which is, of course, USDataManagement.com. And you can see upcoming webinars there as well as listen to other recorded sessions. They'll be posted on the webinar page of the site. Any questions, just let me know and I can get you connected offline. Let's see, our first question is coming from Bill. he says, let's see, do you have to use that risk scoring system? Can you use a different numbering system?
That's a good question. I get that asked quite frequently. Let me go back to the scoring system that we talked about. So here we have the 4 points, 3 points, 1 point. For risk scoring, I've done this over so many years in different frameworks. This is one particular example that we use, Bill. And you could use your own type of scoring system. You could use your own type of parameters. We've had clients go from scoring systems that went from 1 to 100, and they put it in quadrants of 1 to 25 and 26 to 50 and so forth. So this is the most common use for supplier audits. We go from the 4 point down to 0, but certainly you could use your own type of scoring system and have it, for your best use in your particular organization. Okay?
Terrific. We have a question from Roseanne. She says, what type of vendor questionnaires are acceptable? We have been questioned in the past for forms which include true-false questions and do not have any verification or evidence from the supplier, i.e., you have a document control procedure in place, true/false.
Okay, so your particular forms, yeah, there are different types of forms out there. We've tried to stay away from the true-false type of information. We like to get a little bit more beef in the information that we ask for. For a true qualification, you're going to try to get, again, as much information as you possibly can. And then, again, it's also based on that level and criticality of that vendor. So a true-false could apply to, say, a level 3 and some level 2 type of vendors for your questionnaire. So certainly the whole idea of the questionnaires and the different types that we use, that could be actually a whole nother webinar that we could do to go over the different aspects of it. So if you're really hung up on that, I'd be certainly willing to take that offline and talk to you about that. But certainly look for that in the future. That's actually one of the areas we've been looking at, is to take a look at some of the forms, templates, and questionnaires for these types of audits. So, okay.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, Mary is asking if we can elaborate a bit more on how we use the supplier scorecard as described. Was it applied only at the beginning of process?
Okay. So great question. It's applied on the supplier scorecard. It's applied at the beginning of a process. It also could be used at the end of the process. So let's go to that scorecard. Where was it here? So if you take a look at the way you're going to do your risk, initially you're going to identify that vendor, and you could start applying the risk, the scorecard immediately. Then you're going to have vendors that you're going to go on site and gather additional information. From that information, you can either update your scorecard or create a new one based on that new information that you found. And then obviously on the follow-up type of audits that you'll do, you're going to revise that scorecard. So initially you could use it in the very beginning, to your point, but you can certainly and will use it towards the end of the process as well to come up with your final determination. So.
Very good. Okay, Aaron is asking, do you see a compliance issue with using an unvalidated Excel spreadsheet for vendor tracking?
No, I don't see. If you take so this basically goes to my risk-based validation background. So if you look at your an unvalidated spreadsheet to track all this information, what's the risk of using that unvalidated spreadsheet for determining these factors? So what you want to take a look at is who has access to that particular spreadsheet? What is the likelihood that someone's going to get into that spreadsheet and change these ratings, therefore affecting the ranking of the suppliers? So, using an unvalidated spreadsheet to handle, or any type of system to handle this information, is basically at risk and it depends on the type of suppliers you have, your contracts with them, and if they're all level 1 suppliers, and you have information in an unvalidated system that's exposed to the threat of corruption, then you could be in for a little bit of trouble. So, but again, you can use an unvalidated system to hold it if you determine that the risk isn't as great, if the likelihood and the threat level isn't there for your organization. So just be careful of that. You always look at the data. Devil's in the details of the data with applying risk to certain areas, and this certainly is one of the areas that would apply to. You have to take a look at what data that spreadsheet is holding. Okay?
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to circle back to Mary's initial question for the supplier scorecard. Part 2 is she's saying that she was looking for more specifics around the specific scorecard row. It was a little confusing.
Oh, okay. All right. So if that's what we're looking at right now, so on what particular row? The final scorecard, I guess, is what we're looking at right here. Okay, the assignment of the ratings, so the high risk, is that what we're looking at, or did she want some more information on each particular row that we have here? Because all the rows are different. Oh, this right here, the GMP supplier scorecard. I'm sorry. I'm very sorry. I thought you meant risk rating. That's my fault. So the GMP supplier scorecard rating is something that is another standard that's used out there. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a list of ratings for each supplier that you may have, and there's information based on a questionnaire that you're going to gather. And as I mentioned, there were items like, does this vendor have a quality manual? Is it in use? What is your testing procedures? What is your distribution procedures? How secure is your building? Anything that falls under GMP type of, if it's a GMP-related item and those questions relate to that, that's how you come up with your overall scorecard. And what we use is unacceptable, minimally acceptable, and approved. So again, you could take a look at that. We have it on the SOPs that we've developed for our clients, the actual supplier scorecard. And again, this is a whole other area where we can get into under GMP suppliers. And that could actually be another webinar as well. So I'm sorry if I didn't hit all the points you were looking for on here. That's the problem sometimes with webinars on specific questions. But again, there is a lot of information that's gathered for these for a particular supplier if it's GMP related, and that's what the scorecard is. And we use that in our risk analysis. Okay. That's
great, Bob. Mary says, understood. Thank you. It's good information there. Okay, another question from Steve. Would it be acceptable to qualify a vendor solely based on their being certified by ISO 9001, 13485, or a similar body?
Yeah, so ISO certainly falls into that category. All you want to do is you want to pull their certifications, take a look at them, make sure they're valid. And again, now depending on risk of that particular vendor, for the most part, you can base it on some ISO certifications if they are fully certified. I've done qualifications on certain vendors for hosted systems or SaaS environments that I went in and just took a look at their NIST standards and that type of thing and security, and I passed them right away. But for the ISO vendors, generally yes. But again, if they're a high-risk type of vendor, you may want to pull just a little bit more information there. But that's a great question because we run into that all the time, and obviously you do as well.
Okay, we have a good question from Carol. She says, you mentioned forms that you use. We have our own, but we can use multiple types of forms depending on the levels that you talked about. But can we use multiple forms? Sorry.
Okay, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So again, when we go in and as U.S. Data Management, we have our own types of forms. I've developed my own over the years individually, and when we go into a client, we'll either use their own forms or we could use ours. So, and there are multiple types of forms that you could use for questionnaires depending on the information that you want to gather. So if your initial classification is a 1 versus a 3, you may have a different form for a 1 versus a 3. That's certainly acceptable, okay, as long as you're consistent with it, okay, but you can use different forms.
All righty. Pradeep is asking, let's see, he says, I saw wholesalers versus distributors. How can we make that distinction of how much an audit we perform? We have both.
Okay, all right. Actually, that was funny you asked that. We actually went through that with a client. They wanted to find out if they could distinguish between a wholesaler and a distributor. And what you have to do, Pradeep, is basically go to your contract and see within the contract who's responsible for what. And if that particular vendor is if it's the wholesaler responsible for, say, within a mock recall, notifications and publicity out to the general public for, a catastrophic type of recall, you have to take a look at the contract to figure out that level of distinction between those two suppliers. Okay, so that's the easiest way to say this. I know I did mention the wholesaler and supplier for, I believe it was in a case study, but that particular, here it is, yeah, wholesalers versus suppliers for this company, that's what we had to do. We had to take a look at the contract and make that distinction, okay?
Somewhat along the same lines, Tracy's asking, how can we categorize alternate suppliers that may not be used as often?
Oh, okay. Well, obviously, you almost answered your own question. If they're not used as often, you certainly want to put that them into a category of a frequency category of less than a supplier that you use all the time. But if you don't use a supplier, say you use a supplier once a year, but that supplier supplies a very critical part of your manufacturing process, you just happen to get it from them once a year, then you still have to apply the risk to that supplier. Your frequency of audit will certainly be reduced, and you can put them in their own category if it's a once a year or once every 2 years or, I don't know, once a quarter compared to your other suppliers. But again, if it's a very important critical element, if they fall under that critical level 1 and they're ranked as a high risk, even though you're not doing them as often, you still should categorize them with your other suppliers.
All right, and part 2 from Tracy, how do we incorporate the TSE/BSE evaluation into the wider supplier management program?
Well, you could actually take that level and incorporate it right into its own, say, column for risk with that type of information. So really, if you want to, you could take any type of category within your organization, and where I showed you that risk-based approach and the different levels and parameters, you could add that type of level to your own process. So it's very easily done, and other companies have done that type of approach.
All right. Bob, I think we'll take one last question here. It's from Roseanne, asking, do agreements need to be in place for all suppliers, even level 3?
Yeah, well, generally, agreements should be in place for every single supplier, because even a level 3, you have certain legalities that you're at risk for with a supplier, because that level 3 vendor, even though they're supplying, say, pest control, okay, there's still a certain risk with using any kind of vendor or supplier. So if it's not too much trouble, yeah, absolutely try to get the agreements in place before using those level 3s. You can start using them initially if the agreement is a work in progress, all right, because they are level 3, but eventually you do want that in place, okay?
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. It's been quite a few minutes here of good questions, so thank you for your involvement and jumping in there. We do welcome any feedback. We appreciate comments and additional questions, anything that could assist us in continual improvement. We're open to suggestions for future presentation topics. If you have a certain pain point or something that we can help you along the lines of quality auditing, vendor, supplier, et cetera. Encourage you to share with your teammates, other departments that may need assistance in compliance. Our website, of course, USDataManagement.com. There's a great overview of all of the practices that USDM covers, and we're happy to address questions along those lines or offer compliance support as well. We do understand your time is valuable, so we take it as quite a compliment that you join us for this session. Bob, we so appreciate you being available for this. And to our audience, on behalf of the USDM team, we appreciate the opportunity to team with you towards excellence in compliance. Have a great day.